The alarm bells rang through every deck of the massive Nexus station. Admiral Kethvar pressed his six-fingered hand against the cold metal wall as the station shook again. Even here, 15,000 light-years from the front lines, they could feel the war. "Another system has fallen," his aide reported, her blue skin pale with fear. "The Devourer swarm consumed the Altair colonies 3 hours ago. That makes 847 star systems lost." Kethvar closed his eyes. Each number represented billions of lives. Families torn apart, entire civilizations wiped from existence. The swarm moved like a plague across the galaxy, eating everything in its path to fuel its endless growth. The War Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 12 species gathered around the massive holographic display. Each alien form was different, some tall and thin like the crystal Vorthak, others floating in energy fields like the ghostly ethereals. But they all shared the same expression of barely controlled panic. "The situation is critical," announced High Commander Zixtar, his 4 arms gesturing at the red zones spreading across the galactic map. "Our combined fleets have fought bravely for 3 standard cycles. We have thrown our best technology at this threat. Quantum weapons, time manipulation devices, planet crackers that can split moons in half. And yet we only slow them down," added ethereal speaker Mistelara, her voice echoing from within her energy form. "The swarm adapts to everything we use against it. Every weapon we fire teaches it how to build better defenses." The Vorthak representative, a being made of living crystal, clicked his thoughts into the translator. "My people have calculated the odds. At current consumption rates, the galaxy will fall within 18 months. Perhaps less." Silence fell over the chamber. These were the most advanced species in known space. The Zephyrians could manipulate energy itself, bending light and heat to their will. The hegemony had ruled over 1,000 worlds for millions of years with their superior technology. The synthetics had computational power that could predict the movement of stars. None of it mattered against the swarm. "There must be something we haven't tried," said Commander Veltar, of the Trade Federation. "Some technology we haven't developed. Some strategy we haven't considered." Admiral Kethvar studied the holographic display. Red zones marked where the swarm had consumed everything. Yellow showed areas under immediate threat. Green represented safe space, but those zones grew smaller every day. "Actually," he said slowly, "there might be one option we haven't explored." The other representatives turned to look at him. Kethvar rarely spoke in council meetings unless he had something important to say. "The newest members," he continued, "species that think differently than we do. Maybe fresh perspectives could help." High Commander Zixtar made a sound that translated as scorn. "You mean the primitives? The ones still using chemical rockets and nuclear weapons? What could they possibly offer that we haven't already tried?" "Desperation makes us consider options we normally wouldn't," Kethvar replied. "The Rigelians joined 50 years ago. Their bioweapons might be useful. The Centauri Alliance has interesting ideas about guerrilla warfare." "And the humans?" asked ethereal speaker Mistelara. The chamber fell quiet. Humanity was the newest species to achieve faster-than-light travel. Their technology was so primitive that most council members viewed them as barely above barbarians. They had exactly 12 ships capable of interstellar travel, and their most powerful weapons were fusion bombs that other species had abandoned thousands of years ago. "The humans," Zixtar said with another scornful sound, "barely qualify as a spacefaring civilization. They've been in space for less than 200 of their years. What could they possibly contribute to a war against machine intelligence that has consumed nearly 1,000 star systems?" But Admiral Kethvar was studying something on his personal display. According to their files, humans have an unusual history. They've spent their entire evolution fighting wars against impossible odds. Their planet was harsh. They competed with predators much larger and stronger than themselves. "So have many species," Commander Veltar pointed out. "Yes. But most species eventually developed technology to overcome those challenges. Humans kept fighting with primitive tools for much longer. They have extensive records of smaller groups defeating much larger, better-equipped enemies through unconventional tactics." The Vorthak representative clicked thoughtfully. "You suggest their primitive nature might be an advantage?" "I suggest that when conventional wisdom fails, maybe we need unconventional thinking," Kethvar said. "What have we got to lose?" The vote was close. 7 species in favor, 5 against. It passed only because the alternative was certain defeat. On Earth, General Sarah Chen was inspecting the human defense fleet when the message arrived. 12 ships hung in space around Luna Station. Everything humanity could put into space that was capable of interstellar flight. They looked tiny and fragile compared to the massive alien vessels she had seen in diplomatic videos. The message came through quantum encryption that hurt her head to think about. The translation software struggled with concepts that had no human equivalent. But the basic meaning was clear. The galaxy was dying, and they wanted Earth's help. Chen laughed, but there was no humor in it. Humanity's entire space fleet could probably fit inside the cargo bay of a single alien cruiser. Their most advanced weapon was a fusion torpedo that aliens considered a primitive firecracker. But as she read the tactical reports that came with the message, her expression grew serious. The Devourer swarm wasn't just powerful, it was smart. It learned from every encounter, adapted to every weapon, evolved countermeasures to every strategy the aliens tried. "Ma'am," asked her aide, Lieutenant Rodriguez. "Your orders?" Chen stared out at Earth through the viewport. Her home planet looked so peaceful from here. Blue oceans, white clouds, green continents where 8 billion humans lived their lives unaware that their entire species might be extinct within 2 years. She thought about humanity's history. Every major war they had ever fought. Every time a smaller, weaker force had faced impossible odds and somehow found a way to win. Not through superior technology, but through superior thinking. "Send a reply to the Galactic War Council," she said finally. "Tell them General Sarah Chen will attend their war meeting, and send orders to all ship commanders. I want complete tactical analyses of every engagement the aliens have fought against this swarm. Every detail they have." "Ma'am, with respect, what can we possibly do that they haven't tried? Their technology is thousands of years ahead of ours." Chen smiled grimly. "Maybe that's exactly the problem, Lieutenant. Maybe they've gotten so advanced that they've forgotten how to fight dirty." As Earth's single diplomatic shuttle prepared for the journey to Nexus Station, Chen reviewed everything she could find about asymmetric warfare. Throughout human history, technological superiority hadn't always guaranteed victory. Sometimes the side with better technology lost to enemies who refused to fight by the rules. The Galactic War Council was about to learn something that humanity had never forgotten. When you can't win through strength, you change the nature of the fight itself. But first, she had to convince them to listen to ideas that would sound insane to minds that thought in terms of technological solutions to every problem. She had to make them understand that sometimes the most advanced strategy was learning how to think like primitives again. The shuttle jumped to hyperspace, carrying humanity's representative toward a war that would test everything the galaxy thought it knew about intelligence, strategy, and survival. General Sarah Chen felt very small as her shuttle docked with Nexus Station. The docking bay alone was larger than most Earth cities, filled with ships that could have housed her entire species. Alien crew members moved about their duties, some floating in energy fields, others walking on 6 legs, a few that seemed to be made of liquid metal. Her escort, a tall being with purple skin and too many joints in his arms, led her through corridors that hummed with technology she couldn't begin to understand. "The War Council is already in session," he explained through his translator device. "You are the last to arrive." The way he said it made Chen think they had been waiting for her out of politeness, not necessity. The War Council chamber was even more impressive than the docking bay. A massive dome filled with floating holographic displays showed the current state of the galaxy. Red zones marked where the Devourer swarm had consumed everything. The red was spreading like a disease across the stars. 12 different alien species sat around a circular table that could have been mistaken for a small moon. Chen's chair looked like an afterthought, positioned slightly outside the main circle. The message was clear. Humanity was here as an observer, not an equal participant. "Ah, the human representative has arrived," said Admiral Kethvar, the gray-skinned being who had pushed for including Earth in these discussions. "General Chen, please join us. We were just reviewing our current strategic position." The holographic display zoomed in on a section of space where hundreds of alien ships faced off against something that hurt Chen's eyes to look at directly. The swarm ships didn't follow any design logic she understood. They seemed to be constantly changing shape, rebuilding themselves even as she watched. "This is the front line at Kepler Fortress," explained High Commander Zixtar, his forearms pointing at different parts of the display. "We have concentrated our finest ships and most powerful weapons there. The Zephyrian energy manipulators, Vorthak planet crackers, ethereal mind control vessels, and synthetic computational warfare units. Chen studied the display. Even with her limited understanding of space warfare, she could see the problem. The alien forces were arranged in traditional battle formations like armies from Earth's ancient past, lined up on a field. It looked organized and logical. The swarm forces looked like chaos, but Chen noticed something the aliens seemed to miss. The chaos had patterns. The swarm wasn't just randomly attacking, it was probing, testing, learning from each engagement. "What are the casualty reports?" she asked. The chamber fell silent. Several aliens exchanged glances that their translators couldn't interpret. But Chen didn't need technology to understand embarrassment. "We have lost 40% of our fleet strength over the past cycle," admitted Commander Veltar quietly. "The swarm adapts to our tactics faster than we can develop new ones. Every weapon we use teaches them how to build defenses against it," added the Vorthak representative, his crystal form flickering with what might have been frustration. "Every strategy we employ gets countered within days." Chen nodded slowly. "May I see the detailed engagement records? Every battle, every tactic you've tried, every result?" "Of course," said Zixtar, though his tone suggested he thought it was pointless. "Though I'm not sure what patterns you might see that our most advanced tactical computers have missed." For the next 6 hours, Chen reviewed battle after battle. The aliens had tried everything their advanced civilizations could imagine. Direct assault with overwhelming firepower, coordinated strikes from multiple directions, defensive formations designed to absorb and redirect swarm attacks, technological solutions involving time manipulation, quantum disruption, and energy weapons that could crack planets. All of it failed, because it was predictable. The aliens thought like advanced civilizations. They used their best technology in the most efficient way possible, but the swarm had evolved specifically to counter advanced civilizations. "What about these anomalies?" Chen asked, pointing to sections of the tactical reports that seemed inconsistent. "Sometimes the swarm completely destroys everything in a system. Other times it leaves survivors, takes only part of the resources. Sensor errors," said the ethereal speaker dismissively, "or calculation mistakes in our damage assessments. When facing technology this advanced, some imprecision is inevitable, but Chen didn't think they were errors. She had spent her career studying military intelligence, and these patterns reminded her of something. The swarm wasn't just consuming resources, it was gathering information, testing different approaches to see what worked best. "Have you tried any non-technological approaches?" she asked. The question seemed to confuse several council members. "What do you mean?" asked Admiral Kethvar. "Deception. False intelligence. Making the enemy think you're doing one thing while actually doing another. Basic misdirection." The chamber erupted in clicking, buzzing, and whistling sounds that the translator struggled to convert. From what Chen could understand, the concepts she was suggesting ranged from impossible to incomprehensible to these advanced minds. "The swarm has computational power beyond anything we can imagine," explained Zixtar patiently, as if speaking to a child. "It analyzes our energy signatures, tactical formations, and weapon characteristics in real time. Deception against such intelligence is meaningless. Besides," added the synthetic representative, its voice perfectly emotionless, "advanced civilizations do not engage in deliberate falsehood. It is inefficient and logically inconsistent." Chen felt a chill of understanding. These species had become so advanced, so logical, so efficient that they had lost the ability to think like their primitive ancestors. They couldn't conceive of strategies that weren't based on technological superiority, because they had never needed to. Humanity, on the other hand, had spent most of its history being outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched. They had learned to win by refusing to fight fair. "What is Earth's contribution to our war effort?" asked Commander Veltar. "What technology can your species provide?" Chen looked around the chamber at beings who could manipulate time, reshape matter, and command the fundamental forces of the universe. Then she thought about humanity's 12 ships with their chemical rockets and fusion bombs. "We'll send our fleet to support your operations," she said carefully. Several aliens made sounds that the translators interpreted as polite agreement mixed with barely concealed doubt. 12 primitive ships wouldn't make any difference in a war being fought with planet-killing weapons. "Where would you like us to deploy?" Chen continued. "The Kepler fortress could use additional support," suggested Kethvar diplomatically, "though I should warn you it's extremely dangerous." The swarm's attacks there have destroyed ships far more advanced than yours. We understand the risks, Chen replied, but I'd like to request something first. Complete intelligence files on every swarm encounter. Not just the tactical summaries, but every detail you have. Communication intercepts, behavioral analysis, energy patterns, everything. That's a massive amount of data, said Zixtar. Much of it would be incomprehensible to your current technology level. We'll manage, Chen said. Sometimes fresh eyes see things that experienced ones miss. As the council meeting ended, Chen felt the weight of what she was planning. The aliens expected humanity to contribute what little they could to a conventional war effort. They had no idea that she was already planning something completely different. While the greatest fleets in galactic history prepared for what they believed would be the decisive battle, Chen was thinking about older forms of warfare, types of conflict that had nothing to do with who had the biggest weapons or the most advanced technology. She was thinking about wars won by making the enemy defeat themselves. The question was whether 12 human ships could execute a strategy that the combined might of 12 advanced civilizations couldn't even imagine, and whether they could do it before the galaxy ran out of time. Captain Marcus Webb stared at the sealed orders on his personal display and wondered if General Chen had finally lost her mind. Around him, the bridge of the UES Defiance hummed with activity as his crew prepared for what they all knew was a suicide mission. "Captain," called Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the communication station, "we're receiving final deployment orders from the War Council. All human vessels are to proceed to Kepler Fortress and integrate with the main fleet." "Acknowledged," Webb replied, but he made no move to change course. Instead, he looked at the 12 blips on his tactical display. The entire human space fleet scattered across 1,000 light-years of space. Each ship was heading in a different direction, away from the main battle. The aliens thought humanity was running. Webb almost laughed at the irony. If only they knew what the human ships were really carrying. 3 days earlier, General Chen had returned from the War Council with the strangest orders in military history. Each human ship was to load specific cargo, not weapons or supplies, but something far more dangerous. Information. False information, carefully crafted to look real. "Sir," said his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Torres, "the alien fleet commanders are requesting our position and estimated arrival time at Kepler Fortress. Tell them we're experiencing engine difficulties," Webb ordered. Estimate arrival in 72 hours. It wasn't entirely a lie. The Defiance was pushing her fusion engines harder than they were designed to handle, but not toward the fortress. They were heading for the outer rim of swarm-occupied space, carrying cargo that would either save the galaxy or get them all killed. Webb opened his personal files and reviewed the intelligence package one more time. Months of careful work by Earth's best minds had gone into creating these documents. Fake technical specifications for weapons that didn't exist, false energy signatures for ships that were never built, elaborate lies about humanity's true technological capabilities. The key insight had come from studying the swarm's behavior patterns. The machine intelligence was incredibly advanced, but it had developed exactly the kind of blind spot that advanced civilizations always developed. It assumed that other intelligences were as logical and efficient as itself. The swarm had learned to counter every advanced weapon, every sophisticated strategy, every logical tactical approach, but it had never encountered an enemy that would deliberately lie about its own capabilities. "Contact from the Endeavor, sir," Kim reported. "Captain Martinez confirms she's reached her deployment zone. The Horizon and the Steadfast are also in position." Across the galaxy, human ships were taking up positions that made no tactical sense to anyone watching. They weren't forming defensive lines or preparing for conventional attacks. Instead, they were scattered seemingly at random throughout space that the swarm had already conquered or was moving toward. Webb opened a channel to his crew. "All hands, this is the captain. In 6 hours, we begin an operation that our alien allies would consider impossible. We're going to lie to a machine intelligence that can calculate the movement of stars and predict the outcome of battles before they begin." He could hear nervous laughter from some stations. The plan was insane by any rational measure. "But here's what the aliens don't understand," Webb continued. "The swarm's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. It's too smart to believe that anyone would be stupid enough to try what we're about to do." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While the combined alien fleets prepared for a conventional battle at Kepler Fortress, the human ships would begin broadcasting false technical data throughout swarm-controlled space. Not random lies, but carefully crafted deceptions designed to make humanity appear far more technologically advanced than they actually were. "Beginning transmission protocol," announced Kim. On screens throughout the ship, scrolling data began broadcasting on multiple frequencies. To anyone monitoring, it would appear that the small human vessel was leaking technical specifications for weapons that could crack moons, shields that could stop supernovas, and energy sources that made fusion look like a candle flame. None of it existed. It was all fiction, created by teams of scientists and engineers who had spent months learning to lie convincingly to a machine intelligence. "Transmission detected by swarm scouts," Torres reported. "They're analyzing the data." Webb held his breath. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Either the swarm would dismiss the transmissions as obvious falsehoods, or it would do what advanced intelligences always did when faced with apparent technological superiority: assume the data was real and begin calculating responses. "Sir," Torres said, his voice tight with excitement, "swarm ships are altering course. They're moving toward our position." It was working. The machine intelligence that had conquered nearly 1,000 star systems was taking the bait. It was treating primitive humanity as a serious technological threat based on nothing more than convincing lies. But the real test was yet to come. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out as each human ship began its own deception campaign. The U.S. Horizon, commanded by Captain Sarah Okafor, broadcast false data about humanity's quantum tunneling weapons while running silent through an asteroid field. The transmissions made it appear that her ship could strike targets across interstellar distances instantaneously. Captain Liu Chang of the Meridian let his ship's fusion reactor appear to overload while broadcasting specifications for a controlled antimatter cascade that could supposedly destroy entire solar systems. To swarm sensors, it looked like humanity was testing weapons of unimaginable power. Each deception was carefully coordinated. The false technical data told a consistent story: that humanity had been hiding its true capabilities, using primitive-appearing technology to disguise weapons that surpassed anything the galaxy had ever seen. It was the kind of long-term strategic deception that only a species with humanity's history of asymmetric warfare could have conceived, and it was working. "Captain," Kim called out, "I'm receiving emergency transmissions from Kepler Fortress. The swarm it's doing something unexpected." Webb pulled up the long-range sensor data and felt his heart skip. Massive swarm formations were breaking off from their systematic advance toward the fortress. Instead, they were scattering across the galaxy, racing toward the locations where human ships were broadcasting. Their false technical data, the machine intelligence that had never been successfully deceived, was committing huge resources to hunt down weapons that existed only in carefully crafted lies. "How? Long until the first swarm forces reach us?" Webb asked. 18 hours, sir." Webb nodded grimly. The easy part was over. Now came the real test. Could 12 human ships armed with nothing but fusion weapons and chemical rockets actually survive long enough for their deception to work? The answer would determine whether humanity's strategy of weaponized stupidity could save a galaxy, or whether they had just ensured that the most primitive species would be the first to die. But as Webb watched swarm ships racing across the galaxy to counter threats that didn't exist, he felt something that the aliens had lost touch with long ago: the savage satisfaction of watching a more powerful enemy make exactly the mistake you wanted them to make. "All stations, prepare for combat," he ordered. "Time to see if we can be dumb enough to outsmart the smartest enemy in the galaxy." Admiral Kethvar watched the tactical display in growing bewilderment as the Battle of Kepler Fortress unfolded exactly as predicted, and completely wrong at the same time. The massive alien fleet hung in perfect formation around the fortress, their most advanced weapons charged and ready. Zephyrian energy manipulators bent space itself into defensive barriers. Forthak planet crackers powered up weapons that could split moons. Ethereal mind control ships reached out with psychic tendrils toward the approaching swarm. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and they were losing anyway. "Swarm adaptation rate is accelerating beyond all projections," reported his tactical officer, her blue skin pale with stress. They're countering our quantum shields faster than we can recalibrate them. On the display, swarm ships flowed like liquid metal, changing shape and function in real time. Every weapon the aliens fired taught the enemy how to build better defenses. Every defensive measure they deployed gave the swarm new ideas for attacks. "Where are the human ships?" demanded High Commander Zixtar over the communication channel. "They were supposed to arrive 6 hours ago." Kethvar checked his long-range sensors. The 12 primitive human vessels were scattered across the galaxy, apparently fleeing in different directions. He felt a mixture of disappointment and understanding. What else could they have expected from such a young species when faced with impossible odds? "Sir," his communications officer called out, "I'm detecting some unusual transmissions from human ships. They appear to be broadcasting technical specifications, probably calling for help," muttered Zixtar, "or surrendering to the swarm." But Kethvar was studying the transmission data more carefully. The specifications didn't look like distress calls or surrender offers. They looked like weapons data, advanced weapons data that made no sense for a species that still used chemical rockets. "This can't be right," he said, scrolling through the technical readouts. "According to this, the humans have developed quantum tunneling weapons and controlled antimatter cascades." His tactical officer looked over his shoulder. "Sir, those energy readings would indicate weapons powerful enough to destroy star systems. That's impossible for their technology level." Before Kethvar could respond, something unprecedented happened on the battle display. A significant portion of the swarm forces suddenly broke formation and began accelerating away from Kepler Fortress. "What are they doing?" asked Commander Veltar from his flagship. "Where are they going?" The answer became clear as tracking data showed swarm forces racing toward the scattered positions of human ships across the galaxy. Thousands of enemy vessels that had been moments away from overwhelming the fortress were now spreading out over hundreds of light years. "They're chasing the humans," Kethvar said in amazement. "But why would they prioritize 12 primitive ships over our main fleet?" The pressure on the alien defensive lines suddenly lessened as the swarm split its forces. Ships that had been on the verge of destruction found themselves facing half as many enemies. The tide of battle didn't turn, but it stopped being a complete rout. 500 light-years away, Captain Webb of the UES Defiance was discovering what it meant to be hunted by a machine intelligence that could calculate the movement of galaxies' swarm. "Interceptors closing fast," reported Lieutenant Commander Torres. "They'll be in weapons range in 10 minutes. Webb studied his options and didn't like any of them. His ship was fast for human technology, but the swarm vessels moved like they weren't bound by the same laws of physics. They changed direction without momentum, accelerated without visible propulsion, and seemed to know exactly where his ship was going before he did. "Continue broadcasting the false technical data," he ordered, "and prepare to demonstrate humanity's secret weapon." "Sir?" Torres looked confused. "What secret weapon?" Webb smiled grimly. "Our complete willingness to do things that make no logical sense." Instead of trying to outrun the swarm ships, Webb did something that violated every principle of space combat. He turned directly toward them and accelerated to ramming speed. The swarm vessels, designed to counter logical tactical responses, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Their computational systems couldn't understand why a primitive ship would deliberately fly into a superior force unless it had some kind of devastating surprise attack planned. In that moment of hesitation, Webb fired everything his ship had: fusion torpedoes, chemical explosive charges, and even the ship's waste disposal system. None of it should have been effective against swarm armor, but the enemies were so busy calculating responses to imaginary superweapons that they weren't properly defending against actual primitive attacks. 1. Swarm ship took critical damage from what was essentially a very large firecracker, not because the weapon was powerful, but because the enemy had allocated all its defensive resources to countering the quantum weapons it thought Webb was hiding. "Direct hit," Torres shouted in amazement. Their shields were configured wrong. They weren't expecting chemical explosives. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy as human ships engaged swarm forces with tactics that ranged from brilliant to insane. Captain Martinez of the Endeavour used her ship's atmospheric processors to create a massive cloud of industrial lubricant, then ignited it with sparks from deliberately overloaded electrical systems. The resulting explosion wasn't powerful enough to destroy a swarm ship, but it disrupted their sensors long enough for her to escape. Captain Zhang let his fusion reactor go into actual meltdown while broadcasting fake specifications. for a controlled antimatter cascade. The swarm ships approaching him interpreted the reactor failure as a test of the imaginary weapon and retreated to a safe distance, allowing Zhang and his crew to escape in life pods. But the real genius of the plan was becoming clear back at Kepler Fortress, where the alien commanders watched in growing amazement as the swarm's systematic advance collapsed into chaotic, inefficient hunting missions. "They're treating the humans as the primary threat," observed the ethereal speaker, her energy form flickering with something that might have been admiration. "The machine intelligence is allocating massive resources to counter weapons that don't exist." Admiral Kethavar was beginning to understand what the humans had done. It's not about the weapons. It's about making the enemy think there are weapons. The swarm is too advanced to conceive that someone would lie about their capabilities. For the first time in 3 cycles of warfare, swarm forces were acting inefficiently. They were making mistakes. Ships designed for systematic consumption were wasting time and energy chasing phantoms across empty space. "Sir," called his communications officer, "I'm receiving a transmission from General Chen aboard the human diplomatic vessel." Chen's face appeared on the main screen, and Kethvar was surprised to see her smiling. "Admiral, I hope you're taking advantage of the breathing room we've bought you." "General Chen," Kethvar said carefully, "what exactly have your ships done? The swarm's behavior patterns have changed completely." "We gave them a problem their intelligence couldn't solve," Chen replied. "How do you fight an enemy that refuses to be logical?" "The swarm evolved to counter advanced civilizations. It never learned to deal with barbarians who fight dirty. Across the galaxy, the most advanced machine intelligence ever encountered was learning a lesson that humanity had never forgotten. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the best weapons, but the one willing to break all the rules." The question now was whether the galaxy's other species could learn to think like humans before the swarm adapted to this new form of warfare, and whether 12 primitive ships could survive long enough to prove that sometimes the best way to fight the future was to remember the past. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler Fortress, the Emergency War Council convened again in the same chamber where they had first voted to include humanity in their desperate alliance. But everything had changed, Admiral. Kethavar stood before a tactical display that showed something unprecedented. In galactic history, the retreat of the Devourer, swarm. Not a strategic withdrawal or regrouping, but actual chaotic retreat as swarm forces scattered across thousands of light years in increasingly desperate searches for weapons that existed only in human imagination. "The numbers are remarkable," reported the Vorthak representative, his crystal form pulsing with amazement. "Swarm efficiency has dropped by 67%. Their systematic consumption pattern has completely collapsed. More importantly," added Commander Veltar, "we're receiving survival reports from colonies that should have been destroyed months ago. Somehow primitive human settlements are successfully defending against swarm attacks." General Sarah. Chen entered the chamber looking very different from the uncertain human who had first attended their meetings. Her uniform bore the scars of 6 months of impossible warfare, and her eyes held the confidence of someone who had seen the future and helped reshape it. "General Chen," said High Commander Zixtar, his forearms gesture with something that might have been respect. "We owe you an explanation of how this is possible." Chen took her seat, no longer positioned outside the main circle, but placed between the hegemony and Zephyrian representatives as an equal member of the council. "It started with understanding what we were really fighting," she began. "The swarm wasn't just a technological threat. It was an intelligence that had evolved specifically to counter logical, efficient civilizations. It could predict and counter any strategy based on technological superiority." She activated her personal display, showing the scattered positions of swarm forces across the galaxy. Instead of the systematic consumption patterns they had displayed for years, the enemy ships wandered seemingly at random. "So we gave it a problem it couldn't solve. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't follow the rules of advanced warfare?" "But your ship," protested the ethereal speaker. "They're still primitive by our standards. How are they surviving direct contact with swarm forces?" Chen smiled with the kind of expression that the translators struggled to interpret. "Because we learned something that you forgot millions of years ago. Sometimes the most effective weapons aren't the most advanced ones. Sometimes you win by being too stupid for your enemy to predict." The tactical display zoomed in on a recent engagement, where a human freighter had successfully defended, a mining colony against a swarm assault force. The human ship used mining charges and industrial equipment to create a defensive pattern that made no logical sense but somehow worked. The swarm spent so much computational power trying to figure out our hidden advanced weapons that it couldn't adapt to our actual primitive ones, Chen explained. A machine intelligence that can counter quantum weapons gets confused by someone throwing rocks. Admiral Kethvar studied the data with growing understanding. You didn't just deceive them about your capabilities, you made them deceive themselves. Exactly. We broadcast false technical specifications that made humanity appear to be the most advanced species in the galaxy. The swarm allocated massive resources to counter threats that didn't exist, while ignoring the real but primitive threats that did. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The most advanced civilizations in galactic history had been saved by lies told by the most primitive one. There's more, Chen continued. The swarm's obsession with our phantom weapons has created cascading failures in their tactical algorithms. They're not just inefficient now, they're making fundamental errors in judgment. The display showed recent intelligence reports from across the galaxy. Human colonies that should have been obliterated in minutes were reporting successful evacuations using tactics that violated every principle of military science. They ran when they should have fought when they should have run, and somehow convinced swarm forces that random civilian actions were part of elaborate military strategies. How is this possible? Asked the synthetic representative, its emotionless voice carrying a hint of something that might have been confusion. Because lying is a skill, Chen said simply. And we've had millions of years of practice. Every time a human tells a swarm interrogation protocol that their fusion reactor is actually a quantum singularity generator, the machines have to spend computational cycles figuring out if it's true. Every false evacuation route we broadcast forces them to split their search patterns. She paused, looking around the chamber at beings who represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. You all became so advanced that you forgot the most basic truth of warfare. Your enemy's greatest strength is also their greatest weakness. The swarm's intelligence made it unbeatable against logical opponents. But intelligence without wisdom is just very efficient stupidity. The Vorthak representative clicked thoughtfully. You're saying we became too sophisticated to save ourselves? I'm saying you forgot that sometimes the best strategy is the one your enemy can't conceive of, Chen replied. The swarm evolved to fight civilizations that use their best technology in the most efficient way possible. It never learned to fight primitives who refused to be efficient. High Commander Zixtar leaned forward in his chair. What happens now? Can this strategy continue indefinitely? Chen's expression grew serious. That depends on whether you can learn to think like humans before the swarm adapts to our methods. Because eventually it will figure out what we're doing. The question is whether the galaxy can learn to fight dirty before that happens. She activated another display showing training scenarios that human military advisors had been developing for alien forces. We're teaching your people asymmetric warfare. How to lie convincingly. How to use primitive weapons effectively. How to think like underdogs instead of technological superiors. The chamber erupted in clicking, buzzing, and whistling as representatives discussed the implications in their various languages. The concept of deliberately abandoning technological advantages to gain strategic ones was difficult for advanced minds to accept. There's one more thing, Chen said when the noise died down. This war has taught us something important about intelligence itself. You can become so smart that you lose the ability to understand stupidity, so logical that you can't comprehend illogical thinking, so advanced that you forget how primitives actually work. She looked directly at Admiral Kethvar. The next time the galaxy faces an existential threat, don't assume the solution has to be more advanced than the problem. Sometimes the answer is remembering how your ancestors survived when they had nothing but rocks and sticks and the willingness to use them. The War Council voted unanimously to establish permanent human military advisors for all member species. But as the meeting ended, each representative carried with them a disturbing question. What other fundamental truths had they forgotten in their rush toward technological perfection? Admiral Kethvar remained behind as the chamber emptied, staring at the tactical display where swarm forces continued their confused wandering across the galaxy. General Chen, he said quietly, you saved us all. But I have to ask, are we better for having learned to think like you or worse for having forgotten how to think like ourselves? Chen considered the question as she prepared to leave. Maybe the real lesson isn't about thinking like humans. Maybe it's about remembering that intelligence comes in many forms. Some problems need advanced solutions. Others need primitive ones. And the wisest civilizations are the ones that know the difference. As Earth's representative departed for home, the galaxy began the long process of learning to fight like barbarians again. It was a strange education for species that had spent millions of years becoming more sophisticated, but it was an education that might save them all. Because somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the Devourer swarm was still learning too. And the next threat to galactic civilization might be smart enough to see through human lies. When that day came, they would need every advantage that both primitive cunning and advanced technology could provide.